There is a sentence in a UK government planning decision that most people will never read. A planning inspector wrote that the economic benefit of Jeremy Clarkson's farm business had been driven, in part, by his celebrity and his television show, not implied, not paraphrased by a journalist afterward, written, in those words, by the inspector who decided the case. That single line is the reason this story is worth telling properly, and it's also where most coverage of it gets sloppy. So before anything else, here's what that sentence does and doesn't mean, because the difference matters more than the headline. Let's go back to the beginning. In 2019, Jeremy Clarkson took over roughly 1,000 acres near Chadlington, in the Cotswolds, with what he later admitted was a wildly naive idea of how easy farming would be. It wasn't. Machinery failed. A harvest underperformed. A promising flock of sheep didn't survive the way he'd hoped. The farm shop opened almost as damage control, somewhere to sell whatever the land had actually produced, so the year wasn't a total write-off. By 2021, that damage control shop had become something nobody involved had planned for. People weren't driving out for one specific item. They were driving out for the queue itself, for the feeling of being part of something that felt, however manufactured, honest. If you've ever queued for something you didn't strictly need, because everyone else was queuing too, you already understand exactly what was happening at that farm gate. Clarkson wanted the next logical step, a restaurant, serving beef raised on the farm itself, housed in a converted lambing shed. West Oxfordshire District Council refused planning permission. The site sits inside the Cotswolds area of outstanding natural beauty, and officers judged a restaurant out of keeping with that protection. Clarkson didn't wait for a second application. In July 2022, the restaurant opened anyway, on the strength of legal advice that permitted development rights covered it. Beef from the farm's own herd, tables mostly outdoors, a proper menu. It stayed open a little over a month. In August 2022, the council issued a formal enforcement notice. Unlawful change of use, it said. The site had become a mixed leisure and hospitality operation with no permission for most of what was happening on it. Remove the tables, remove the mobile toilets, restore the barn. 6 weeks to comply. Picture the actual scene, not the legal language. A working restaurant, a staff rota built around it, beef already ordered, and a letter arrives telling you to strip it back to bare barn within 6 weeks. Every business owner who has ever bet on forgiveness being easier to get than permission has felt some version of that letter land. Clarkson appealed. Not just the enforcement notice, he separately challenged the council's refusal to let him expand the farm shop's car park from 10 spaces toward 70. Both appeals went to the same planning inspector at a public hearing in March 2023. While the case was pending, Clarkson said publicly he'd had to sell most of the cattle bought for the restaurant and had gone back to using chemicals on land he'd hoped to farm differently. He said he no longer wanted to reopen it. For a public persona built on bravado, that's a strikingly deflated thing to say on the record, while the people deciding the farm's future were still reading. The decision landed on the 14th of June 2023, and it split the case in two. On the restaurant, Clarkson lost outright. The inspector found real, documented harm to the protected landscape, parked cars on verges, disrupted traffic, a barn that no longer read as a barn from the road, and upheld the enforcement notice on that point. Lowland Barn had to be restored. The restaurant was over, permanently. On the farm shop, café, and car parking, the outcome flipped. The inspector granted permission for all three, for a period of 3 years, subject to conditions. Now here's where precision actually matters, because this is the part most retellings flatten into something it isn't. The inspector did not rule that fame is a valid reason to grant planning permission. He didn't create a celebrity exception to the Town and Country Planning Act, and nothing in the decision says a business gets special treatment for being famous. What he did was apply an existing, ordinary planning test. Whether a development's economic benefit to the local area outweighs its harm to a protected landscape. That test exists for any rural business. It's been used for farm shops, breweries, and glamping sites that have nothing to do with television. What made this case unusual wasn't the test, it was the evidence in front of the inspector. Local suppliers testified that a nearby dairy farm might have lost its herd without the trade diddly squat brought it. A local butcher had gone from 3 staff to 10. 27 businesses were named as depending, at least partly, on the shop and café. That is real, measurable economic activity, the kind planning policy is specifically designed to protect. And the inspector was honest enough to name where that scale had come from. His written conclusion doesn't dodge it. The economic benefit had been driven in part by Clarkson's celebrity and the television show. He said the argument for supporting that diversification was, in his words, not without merit, even with celebrity acknowledged as part of what built it. So the accurate version of this story isn't fame won a planning appeal. It's narrower and honestly more interesting than that. An ordinary legal test, weigh the economic good against the landscape harm, produced an extraordinary result, because one input into that test, audience size, had been supercharged by television in a way the test was never built to anticipate. The inspector didn't bend the rule for a celebrity. He applied the rule correctly to a case where celebrity had already reshaped the numbers long before the hearing started. That's a more useful thing to understand than the rules don't apply to famous people, because it tells you exactly where the actual leverage sits, not in the law itself. In the scale of the evidence a business can put in front of an inspector, supplier testimony, employment figures, documented footfall, and a business with a television audience can generate all of that faster and bigger than one without. Here's what's worth sitting with. A farm shop with identical harm to the landscape, run by someone nobody had heard of, would need to build that same evidence base the slow way. Years of trading, word of mouth, local reputation, before it could make the same case to an inspector. Diddley Squat built it inside 3 years, largely because a camera crew had been recording the whole time. You've probably driven past a business that closed quietly, with no appeal and no hearing, because it never got the chance to build a record like that. Not because the rules were against it specifically, because building the evidence an inspector actually weighs takes time, and most small operators don't have a television deal accelerating that clock. There's a genuine irony sitting inside the enforcement notice itself. The council issued it to stop unauthorized activity on protected land. What it produced, once the appeal became public and was covered nationally, was 2 more years of attention for the exact business it was trying to restrain. Attention that, if anything, likely strengthened the very economic case the inspector went on to accept. The council has never treated any of this as a mistake. Their position has stayed consistent throughout. That planning law applies to everyone on that land equally, and that officers spent months trying to find a lawful route before enforcement became necessary. That's a defensible position, and nothing in the inspector's decision actually contradicts it. The law was applied the same way it would be for anyone. What differed was the size of the case a well-resourced, high-profile applicant could build to meet that law's own test. The restaurant never reopened. The barn went back to being a barn. The shop, cafe, and car park kept running, backed by a 3-year permission that will need renewing before 2026 is out. Nobody rewrote planning law because of this case. No new principle exists. What exists is a documented example of how much faster an existing, ordinary legal test can be satisfied when a business's economic footprint has been amplified by fame, and a clear record, in the inspector's own words, that he saw it and named it rather than pretending it wasn't there. If you've made it this far, has your local council ever made a call on a business you couldn't quite square? Drop it in the comments. I read all of them. Subscribe if this is new to you. This channel goes past the headline every time.